When we speak of the Western Front, we often focus on the grand battles and the politics. But the reality of the conflict was fought in a vast, sprawling, festering wound that stretched nearly 475 miles across Europe. For millions of young men, life was reduced to a few feet of muddy earth, roofed by the constant threat of annihilation. This was life in the trenches. But before we even discuss the mud, the lice, or the rats, you must understand this: the trench was designed to save you from the bullet, but it was guaranteed to kill you slowly. How did they endure a home that was also a tomb? We begin by exploring the complex, claustrophobic structure of the trench itself. The trench system was far more complex than a simple ditch. It was a massive network designed for defense in depth. First came the frontline trench, the most dangerous location, typically zigzagged to prevent an enemy shell from sweeping down the entire line. This trench featured a parapet, the earth wall facing the enemy, reinforced with sandbags, and a parados, the wall facing the rear, to protect against shrapnel and observation. Just behind the front line was the support trench, offering a secondary line of defense and providing shelter and staging areas. Behind that lay the reserve trench, housing troops that could be called forward or deployed for counterattack. Connecting these layers were the communication trenches, winding, narrow paths where supplies and men moved, often in single file, under cover. When the men were off duty from the front line, they retreated to dugouts, small, often cramped underground shelters dug into the earth. For the average private, it was often little more than a muddy alcove barely covered with sacking. And then there was no man's land, the deadly, pockmarked stretch of ground separating the opposing front lines. It was a wasteland of barbed wire, shattered trees, and water-filled shell holes. It was utterly devoid of life, yet constantly surveyed by observers. Crossing it meant certain death, its surface perpetually illuminated by the eerie glow of flares and riddled with machine gun fire. This narrow, neutral strip defined the impossibility of movement and the relentless static nature of the war. Stop and consider this: for the men in the trenches, the most lethal enemy was often not the soldier firing from the opposing side, but the earth itself. The mud, the flooding, and the endless maintenance weren't just inconvenient, they were the fundamental, constant threats to survival. Now we must turn to the physical reality of what happens when the human body is forced to live in permanent, unsanitary darkness. The soldier's day began not with the sun, but with the stand-to. Approximately 1 hour before dawn, and again at dusk, every man capable of holding a rifle would stand on the fire step, weapon loaded, peering over the parapet. These were the most dangerous times, as enemy attacks often occurred during the poor visibility of twilight. This routine ensured constant alertness, drilling the fear of a sudden rush into every soldier's consciousness. Once the stand-to ended and the threat subsided, the day settled into what was often called the morning hate. This was a period of random, often ritualistic shelling and machine gun fire, a daily reminder that the enemy was always present, always watching. After the morning hate came the endless cycle of chores and maintenance. The most persistent enemy was the trench itself. Trenches constantly collapsed, particularly after rain, requiring endless hours of shoring up the walls with sandbags and timber. Drainage was an immediate, critical task. Water had to be constantly pumped or bailed out using buckets and empty food tins. If left unchecked, the trench would quickly become a flooded, disease-ridden ditch. The few hours of daylight were also reserved for the small, precious moments of personal maintenance, shaving with cold water, a requirement for officers and often enforced for morale, cleaning rifles of the ever-present mud, and the communal ritual of chatting, a term used for picking lice out of clothing seams. There was no escaping the daily, soul-crushing grind of simply trying to keep the earth from swallowing you whole. Food was functional, rarely comforting. In the morning, men were issued their rations, often stale bread, bacon, and sometimes jam. Hot meals, when they arrived, were cooked in large containers behind the line and carried forward in mess tins, often arriving cold, greasy, and filled with mud or debris. The greatest threats to the meal, however, were not the enemy shells, but the rats. Giant, repulsive brown rats, often described as the size of small cats, infested the trenches by the millions, feeding primarily on the unburied corpses in no man's land. They were fearless, gnawing through food bags, often attempting to steal food from sleeping men, and generally spreading disease and revulsion. Killing them was a constant, futile pastime. For the average soldier, the lack of privacy, the persistent noise, and the constant cycle of chores made the days a blur of numb exhaustion, punctuated by bursts of terror. The most defining characteristic of life in the trench was the mud. It was not just dirt, it was a viscous, heavy substance mixed with blood, excrement, decaying bodies, and chemicals. In dry weather, it turned to choking dust, but in the constant rain, it became a glue that could swallow a man whole. Equipment was lost daily, and movement became an exhausting, debilitating struggle. The combination of standing in cold, wet conditions for days on end led to the single most infamous physical horror of the trenches, trench foot. This non-freezing cold injury caused the feet to swell, turn numb, and eventually become gangrenous due to poor circulation. If left untreated, the only solution was amputation. To combat it, men were often assigned foot inspection duty, where they were required to rub their comrades' feet with whale oil and change their socks repeatedly. Even with these efforts, thousands lost their limbs to this agonizing, preventable condition. Beyond the mud, the physical suffering was relentless. Lice were ubiquitous. Every single soldier had them, constantly crawling over the skin and through clothing. Boiling the clothes often failed to kill the eggs, and the resulting bite spread a condition known as trench fever, causing debilitating headaches, fever, and muscle pain. Dysentery, cholera, and tetanus were rampant due to the lack of proper sanitation. Latrines were often crude and ineffective, constantly collapsing into the trench bottom, mixing human waste with the drinking water and food sources. The air itself was a heavy mixture of damp earth, unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, rotting debris, and the sweet, sickly smell of chlorine gas and high explosives. The overwhelming majority of casualties in the trenches were not caused by bullets or shrapnel, but by the relentless biological warfare waged by disease and filth. It's easy to focus only on the grand charges, but the truth is, the trenches were a constant slaughterhouse of infection and decay. For every 10 men hit by a bullet, 3 more were sickened by dysentery, tetanus, or the agonizing rot of trench foot. But the body was only one battleground. The mind was the other. If the physical conditions didn't kill the men, the psychological conditions often did. There was no safety, ever. Shells could land at any moment, snipers operated continuously. The sound of high explosives was a constant, deafening roar, shaking the earth and the minds of the men within it. The psychological breaking point was known as shell shock, a condition not understood at the time. Victims displayed symptoms ranging from temporary blindness, deafness, and partial paralysis, to constant shaking, mutism, and severe trauma-induced nightmares. It was often dismissed as cowardice or malingering, leading to harsh discipline, including execution. This was the ultimate betrayal. The very conditions of the war were designed to break the mind, and when the mind broke, the system punished it. The only true coping mechanism was the intense camaraderie. Sharing a cigarette, telling dark jokes, or simply standing guard side by side created a bond of shared suffering that was stronger than any national flag. The men lived in a state of hyper-alertness, balancing profound exhaustion with moments of sheer terror. Time became distorted. Letters home often sounded unnaturally cheerful or, conversely, deeply fatalistic, masking the unimaginable horrors their writers were enduring. Their humanity, little by little, was chipped away by the mud, the noise, and the knowledge that at any moment, they could simply cease to exist. The trench was designed to save the body from bullets, but it destroyed the soul. The constant noise, the relentless fear, and the systematic denial of safety created a generation of men whose minds were permanently shattered. Yet, even in this state of perpetual psychological warfare, there was work to be done. And the deadliest work of all happened only when the sun went down. As terrifying as the day was, the real work of the trenches often began at night. Under the cover of darkness, patrols would venture out into no man's land. Their missions were desperate and deadly, repairing damaged barbed wire, staking out defensive positions, or, most terrifyingly, trench raiding. Raids involved small, often masked parties silently crossing the wire to capture enemy soldiers for intelligence, destroy machine gun nests, or simply disrupt the enemy's rest. This was warfare reduced to brutal, primitive knife fights in the dark, close, terrifying encounters that often ended in death or capture. The night, far from offering rest, simply transformed the perpetual dread into active, silent terror. The system was flawed, but the men endured. When you visualize the Great War, remember the mud, the rats, and the shell shock. The trench system was the final expression of 19th-century military thought clashing with 20th-century firepower. But what does that lasting legacy look like for the men who left that terrible place behind? The trench system became the defining feature of the Great War, not a stage for heroes, but a laboratory of human suffering. When the war finally ended, the men who returned were forever marked by the physical scars of the gas and the mud, and the invisible scars of the shock and the continuous dread. Life in the trenches remains history's most profound testament to the cost of industrial warfare, and the resilience, however brutal, of the human spirit.